Don't be shy, everybody. You can show us some love for sure. Thank you. Great, happy to be here. Joey and I have been preparing for this panel now for a couple of weeks. We decided ultimately the best thing to do would be to have just an open, candid, and hopefully fun conversation. So we'll start really quickly, a few introductions. Thank you for the warm intro. I've been working in PR in the blockchain world for about 6 years, kind of seen it all. And I'll just give you a couple minutes to introduce yourself, and then I'll start firing away with questions.
Sure. So I've been involved in the space for a long time. I head things up on the strategy and policy side of things at Xapo. Xapo was, in the olden days, the biggest Bitcoin custodian in the world. We sold our institutional business to Coinbase in 2019, around 1 million BTC, I think back then in custody. And I've helped sort of develop frameworks and regulatory standards all over the world, really. So I form part of interesting think tank, RegTech initiatives in the US, where I've advised different parts of different authorities. And I've also acted as a specialist consultant to the United Nations. So I've trained and assessed probably about 18 countries around the globe, similarly on developing infrastructure and frameworks. So on the Xapo, wearing the Xapo hat, I did also form part of the Libra DM initiative, so we can talk a lot about stable coins and some of the problems faced on that side of things. That was pretty interesting. Yeah, I've been sort of progressing standards. So we are a bank, but a Bitcoin and blockchain native credit institution. So we call that a kind of convergence of standards in lots of different ways. So when we talk about some of them, it was interesting listening to a few things on the previous panel, and hopefully we can talk a bit about the UK and the rest of the world and what's happening, because I have a slightly different take on that stuff.
We will, for sure. I want to rewind just a sec. I want to kind of to ease everyone in, because you've been in crypto since before a lot of people even knew what it was, quite frankly. Some people will consider being in crypto a long time, like a year or two. And of course, you've been in much longer than that. So, what drew you in originally?
Look, I mean, I met the founder of Xapo, who, if anyone is involved in the Bitcoin ecosystem, Wences was sort of one of the true OGs. And he was very inspiring in terms of describing to me what this ecosystem could develop into. At the time, there was no such thing, or law or regulation, so this was like 5 or 6 years before the FATF mentioned anything. So it was a bit, very, very different times. But I will say one thing, like, you know, when anyone talks about technology or, you know, the development of technology in line with sort of the development of whatever regulation and legislation, it's the same playbook that we've seen happen again and again through the whole of history, right? So at the beginning of the file sharing sort of music world, you had the Napsters and you had the Pirate Bays and the sort of illegal concept of sharing data files across the world so people could listen to music infringing copyright all over the place. And that developed into Spotify and you know, Tidal and the Amazon Music principles. And that is now a regulated, controlled environment for using file sharing as a concept. It started in one way, like the internet. The initial adopters were, you know, it was porn and illegal gambling, etc., and it merged into me hitting a button and ordering a sofa to be delivered to my house. And that happens with everything. So, you know, I don't know, the Skype guys, you know, didn't apply for telecoms licenses in 150 countries. You know, VoIP was a concept. No one really quite understood it. And I see the same in the blockchain universe. So in the crypto world now, there are lots of frustrations that people still have with authorities. Back in the day, I mean, that was not the same conversation. In the olden days, in 2013, 2014, if you wanted to have an interaction with the regulator, you know, they might bring a police officer to the meeting with them. Wow. Because it was just, you know, you are literally trying to facilitate something illegal. And those conversations have migrated and moved a long way to where they are today. There's still a long way to go, though.
So that's my next question. Would you say, like, from this time where it was, you know, 4 or 5 years before any type of regulation, like you said, and things have significantly changed, would you say that we are past this kind of wild, wild west narrative, or not quite? Like you said, there might be a ways to go still.
I think in the olden days, you know, the crypto bros would answer questions by saying, look, land, like our regulation isn't going to exist in a year, governments aren't going to be here, and this will all evaporate. And people have gone a long way beyond that. For me, finding the balance between innovation, supporting a new technology, and creating a real ecosystem and environment, and balancing that with regulation, creating a secure environment, or thinking about consumers and all of the good stuff. Those are two different things. And finding the right balance is the critical focus point. And I always encourage the industry, and we've done it across countries, we've done it all over the place, but if you have a conversation with a set of authorities and you listen to them, listen to the risks that they're identifying, and show them how you can control that risk or use the technology to monitor and manage that risk, that's a constructive way to get into a secure output. A non-constructive way is saying, this is all nonsense and it shouldn't apply to us, and we need to operate outside of any perimeter. It's just not going to work. And I think that's a kind of more of a winning conversation now, especially as you see the bigger guys come into the space and institutional markets, counterparty risk and all of that stuff.
So from crypto bros to the Bank of England now, like opening up their appetite to stable coins and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, yes. Yes. In the UK, and this is going to sound a little bit critical, there's been a big song and dance around ETNs going live or retail access to Bitcoin ETN products and massive sort of celebration. For me, that is like ABC catch-up. So that's not anything innovative or breaking. If the BlackRock platform has issued the IBIT and raised $120 billion, and you're now going to suddenly, finally get over the line of accepting a debt instrument to be accessible to a retail investor on a regulated market, that is not progressive, changing the game. That's just basic catch-up. And I think some people celebrate stuff a bit too much. The other, same argument, but you've excluded retail markets from accessing regulated instruments for the last 7 years. What's happened in the market over the last 7 years? What those retail investors want is secure access to a regulated product to gain access to the market. So it's, and same, because I mentioned, because you mentioned the Bank of England, the position the Bank of England took originally was, they would offer a Bank of England account to hold the asset backing the issuance platform of the sterling stablecoin. Sounds great, but the condition would be that there was no interest paid on that deposit. So if you tell Tether to put $100 billion into an account that is zero interest bearing, it literally destroys the model. So it just doesn't commercially work. And then now, more recently, there was a sort of discussion around caps on stablecoins. 10,000 pounds, I think it was, for an individual, 1 million or something for a corporate. And now that's being reconsidered to an extent. That's also basic catch-up. Even when we went through the Libra initiative with every central bank probably in the world and almost every regulatory authority in the world, none of them raised that as a control point, the sort of cap numbers. So the fact that they're considering now removing that is not a really progressive, wonderful thing. It's sort of, look, guys, we're in major, the term, second mover advantage was, and I agree with that. There can be a second mover advantage if you learn from errors and correct them, but there's not a 35th mover advantage, and that's sort of the sensitive balance as well. The stablecoin stuff, when we talk about the caps and everything, again, people maybe don't fully realize this. Why has the Genius Act got the traction that it's got in the US? Why was it such a big push for the president, etc.? Because what it does is regulate an issuance platform for digitized US dollars. So imagine the US government with a big sort of debt number, again, all public information, becoming a massive global exporter of USD to the entire Web3 and digital ecosystem so that it becomes the currency of the blockchain, the currency of the internet, the currency. It's massive net exportation of US dollars. There's a very clear strategic alignment with accomplishing the exit and the Genius Act, because every regulated platform that issues the token is under reserve requirements to buy US treasuries and all of the good stuff. So that's commercial thinking. Like if you start introducing all these caps and the sterling, the same with the EU. Like if the ECB, who've started now sort of progressing the CBDC discussion or whatever, if they issue like controlled closed net environments for a euro currency in a digital format, for me that's like saying, let's create an intranet to compete with the internet. So let's create a closed programmable money system for euro-denominated assets with cross-border currency restrictions, balance restrictions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's going to off-shelf the volumes of USD trade. It's not going to happen. So all of that's a long-winded way of saying these are positive things, but there has to be a bigger realization of what's happening in the world. And it's not just the EU, the UK, and the US. People forget about, Japan and Singapore and how Hong Kong adapted to the Singapore development by introducing the framework that they did and how aggressive they're being now. And there are many, many jurisdictions around the world looking to develop. And it's a global online digital environment. So, people will always conduct jurisdictional assessments and they'll want to have a home base. And many of them want to do that in the City of London. But if it takes too long and it's too restrictive, that does cause headaches, I think.
Amazing.
Yeah.
You just answered like my next 4 questions. So that's cool. We can skip forward a little bit.
No, but to add then that, because we're talking a lot about regulation and all this stuff, I think what people sometimes also need to realize that there's a big advantage of being domiciled in a secure environment. The City of London and the FCA carry a lot of weight. There's a lot of value to that, for sure. But it's not just like regulation. So a lot of platforms in the space, aren't like super aware of the positions that Apple are taking by, adapting their App Store terms and conditions, or Google Play, or even Reddit to an extent, or some of the advertising stuff. So there's an advantage to being based in the UK and facing the world, being based anywhere and facing the world. There's also considerations that all those platforms need to have in terms of the triggers that you have advantage to access the world. You have disadvantage because you're falling within scope of lots and lots of different things around the globe as well. So that's also something I think that groups need to think about and consider a bit.
That's the trick, right? You have companies that are kind of desperate to innovate and push these things forward, and then on the other side you have compliance that's kind of putting a ceiling or boundaries on these certain products that are being developed.
I agree, and also like it's another difficult lesson. If you think about, I've used the Libra example, but Libra was like a platform people, everyone could be as anti-Facebook as they like. It wasn't just Facebook. We had Visa initially, we had Uber and Spotify and Xapo were there and Coinbase were there, etc. You had a very solid group of companies coming together saying, we want to do this properly and we want to do it in a proper regulated environment. We took hundreds of open college meetings and central banks, and every single piece of feedback was taken on board. So it went from a basket of currencies to the USD 1-to-1 and et cetera, never got over the line because the law didn't exist. At the same time, there were other platforms, USDT and others, that weren't trying to do it that way. And they just went full tilt. And now I think more profitable than Goldman Sachs or something with like 200 staff or whatever it is. And that's the other balance question. When people talk about regulation, sometimes if they go like super weighted to being ultra cautious and careful, whilst the ecosystem goes through this lightning speed development and adoption, they almost kill themselves. And that, the balancing of risk is a difficult one. But that's the biggest difference that I see between the US and the UK, or the US and most of the world, to be honest. Because the attitude there is more, it's more along the lines of, firstly, do you understand what you're doing? Do you have the capital? And you've got to go for it. And businesses fail, and that's okay. In the UK and some authorities, it's more a kind of like you've got to be sure that there's as close to 0% chance of anything going wrong that can exist before you're going to get over the... it's a different mentality. It's a different like way. So the US wants there to be 10 unicorns and 100 failures is okay. And the UK also wants 10 unicorns, but they don't want any failures. And when you're developing this kind of ecosystem, that's very difficult. So the risk control systems and mechanisms have to be thought of a little bit differently, I think.
So are there in terms of things being thought of a bit differently, are there like specific lessons maybe from your work in Gibraltar or something that we can like plug and play or take away from?
I think,
or is it too far?
No, look, I think places like Gibraltar, small territories have big advantages because they're so adaptive and fast. And especially in this technology, you need to have frameworks that can adapt and emerge and evolve and develop and act quickly. That is no doubt. But you've also got to compete with the world. And today, the position that the US has taken, remember, they haven't actually developed any framework. I mean, the Genius Act hasn't actually really come into effect and been implemented. It's been adopted, but it hasn't been implemented. So there's still, even in the Genius Act, there are learning pieces. The market structure and the Clarity Act, etc., that's a bill that still has to be passed. So I think they're pretty way behind, but everyone still today assumes the US wants to be the center of the world for crypto, and that's attracting a lot of businesses to build their global-facing, core domicile in the United States. But it's that never-ending balance. Like if you weigh too far towards supporting innovation, and you're too supportive, and the standards are too low, you end up supporting like certain blow-up environments. Bad scenarios that can, and that has happened. There are jurisdictions in the world, even within the EU pre-MiCA, that adopted frameworks, issued at 1,300 licenses, then like retracted 700, then retracted another 700 while say restructured the actual law. I mean, that's a disaster. Like, then you end up with like class actions against the regulator and all that. But then if you go MiCA, and you go super rules-paced, super specific, it's very weighted towards the existing incumbent financial services world. That's too restrictive. So the UK, in the quasi-second mover advantage, ideally would be learning and adapting. But I think it feels like it's gone almost like as or more prescriptive than the EU in some cases. So sure. That's going to be a difficult one.
By the way, like working in PR and seeing news headlines all the time, you'd never guess that Genius Act still hasn't passed. It seems like it's history.
Yeah, and it's the same with the Transatlantic Task Force. So again, it came up in the previous panel. Will there be a global standard for regulation and cross-border acknowledgement of look, it's not going to happen. Like, it hasn't happened in the history of regulation. It's happened to a light degree in the context of GDPR, but not fully. But in the world of regulation, there isn't even alignment with what the definition of a virtual asset is. So if you look at virtual asset definitions, region by region, there are like, in the EU there are 4, quasi 6. In the UK there are almost 3. In the US they have the sort of security commodity, non-commodity alternative class now. Every part of the world is defining the asset differently, let alone the regulated activity. So when I read about the Transatlantic Task Force and this sort of EU, the UK, USA alignment, within 180 days, I thought, wow, that's incredible. I'd love to see that happen. So then I did a review, and I did it for the Senate Banking Committee in the US, and I assessed the proposed bills and frameworks that are being produced in the US against the UK consultation and outputs and etc. And then I assessed them against each other. And it's so misaligned, it's just so completely misaligned. I would love to dream that workforce in 180 days could literally reformat the entire legislative infrastructure for 2 giant financial centers and regions. But I don't know how realistic that is. I mean, that's a...
Are you talking to specific regulators about this? You don't need to like name names or anything, but these types of conversations, like, do you find, first of all, are you having them? And second of all, do you find that they lean more towards like, they view crypto more as a high risk thing still? Or are these conversations becoming more open-minded?
Yeah, I definitely have a lot of conversations with all of them. It's complex sometimes because you have, I don't want to get too technical, but you have the FATF, and they defined what a virtual asset service was, and there are 5 definitions. And then you have to look at each country and see how they're defining the perimeter of what they want to bring within the ecosystem, within the regulated perimeter and not. And I've done like literally gap analysis assessments in about 20 countries, the amount of activities that are out of scope. So they're all kind of like learning and adopting. I would say on the second question, they're much, much more progressive and want to understand. A lot of regulatory authorities have a lot of very, very smart people that are doing great stuff. I don't think sometimes they have the capacity. I think they also, in some jurisdictions, have nowhere near the capacity or expertise. Then they also have, they get worried because when you carry the stamp of approval of, let's say, the FCA, I'm just making up a name, but it carries a lot of weight, and that carries a lot of responsibility for them. So the cautious ones are very nervous about granting that stamp of approval to a business that they don't fully understand. The other metric, or the other end of the scale, if you look at like the FTX blow up and things like that, I also ran fake FTX blow ups in lots of countries to show the authorities what would have happened and what they would have caught and not caught, and etc. And sometimes, so to use the FTX example, not to go sort of regulator bashing or anything, but the rules around like the segregation of customer assets, off balance sheets, insolvency remote, etc. That was in the law, but sometimes you have situations where there isn't enough regulatory understanding and capacity to enforce blockchain-based segregations and monitor that on an ongoing basis, because it takes time and effort. So sometimes they can bring an expert group of people in, develop a really solid framework, but then not actually be able to run it properly, and then you end up with an FTX scenario. So that's also been a steep learning curve lesson for lots of authorities. So yeah, it's a tough one. I think the UK has a lot of really smart people. They have a lot of, it's a huge finance center. Everyone says the same thing. Also, like, people forget common law as a principle, like a form of law that is live and emerges, quasi-develops with technology is so much better than the strict civil coded-based rules. That the EU is one example of that. So there's lots of positives. Plus there's the people. Plus there's the infrastructure. Plus. But I do sometimes have like meetings, even with parliamentarians, and I find it a little bit frustrating because it's almost like too much arrogance of like, well, one comment that I won't forget was literally, Joey, look, we created the internet. So basically everyone will always want to be domiciled in the City of London because we're the most advanced nation on the globe. Wow. And everyone's going to want to base themselves here. And I'm a bit like, well, yeah, I mean, they do want to base themselves here, absolutely, but they're not going to wait forever, and no one is going to sort of sit here, for another 2 years thinking about when the UK get this right, we'll eventually go live. So I think there has to be a bit more, not aggression is the wrong word, but a bit more sort of, Well,
I mean, you also soon, if not already, have a generation of people that take things like the internet for granted. You never think about when it was created or a time before it. So they might be asking for credit for something that's not up for the grabs anymore. But I know we're running out of time. When we were preparing for this, you mentioned that we could talk about this stuff for days. But well, I guess we'll just try to wrap up. Like if we're talking about the next generation, or if we're talking, I guess would like us to leave off on if there's one thing that you're the most excited about in terms of regulation, let's say in the next 5 years or even beyond. If you could put a pin on it, just because I know we only have a little bit of time left. But
wow, excited about regulation. I don't know about,
I know
about that.
know.
But no, look, I think I'm excited about, I'm still excited about the capacity of like open networks properly working in the world. And I think that frameworks and standards allow that to develop in the right way will be like absolutely game changing. I'm nervous about the sort of open network versus closed network development that's happening, you know, where lots of institutions are coming around now saying, you know, we'll create a closed loop system of 5 companies, and it's the intranet versus internet example they gave before. We are Bitcoin native, blockchain native, fully integrated to open networks, and that's the way that it should be. And that competition is going to start to fractionalize the way this industry moves. So I want the regulation to support the right open network approach to, you know, what the technology can achieve.
Very cool. I'm glad we got to do this. I know we're out of time, but if you guys could one more time give it up for Joey Garcia. Thank you for joining us. This was awesome. Thanks for having the time. I appreciate it, man.